final speaker of this slot, Patrick Kemp. Hi, Patrick.
Hello.
Patrick's a game designer living in Seattle. He's worked in games for 17 years, and the last 11 of those were as a game designer at Spry Fox. His tech tree started with Click and Play, Basic on the TI-83, and ActionScript. Pre-parenthood, he was an avid game jammer and slide project noodler alongside his day job work. Cooking games are his favorite kinds of games to make. And you're here to talk about tools, which is my favorite. So take it away, Patrick.
Thank you. So like Alexi said, I'm here to talk about design tooling at Spry Fox. Here's my some little screenshots of some of those side projects. So you might know Spry Fox from some of our earlier games like Triple Town and Alpha Bear. These were games that were kind of based around a unique core mechanic and had this kind of elegant evergreen gameplay as the design philosophy. But in more recent years, Spry Fox has leaned into making bigger games where we've waded into genres like village sims and MMOs, and these games, involve a lot of intertwined systems and rich internal economies. Sometimes they're multiplayer games, and what that all means for us as a team is these games just require a lot more content to kind of make games that work in those genres. There just has to be a lot more stuff in them. And we've certainly grown as a studio over the years, but our design team is still relatively small. So we're always on the lookout for ways to multiply our efforts. And, sometimes that looks like procedural content generation, but a lot of times it's just building efficient tools that, again, allow us to get more bang for our buck as designers. And that's what I'm going to talk about, the tooling piece. Now, occasionally we'll build kind of cool-looking graphical interactive tools, typically for things like editing terrain or set pieces. I'm not going to show any of those today. They look cool, but I don't actually think we're doing anything particularly novel on that front. Instead, I'm going to focus on where the bulk of our design content goes, which is in text files or configs, as we call them. These are just YAML syntax text files that we've built up pipeline and tooling around, and that's where we build most of the sort of the rich design content. And then in our most recent project, we've added this new element called the design dashboard, and that's the thing I'm really excited to talk about. That's the whole reason I wanted to give this talk, because it's this new thing we're trying that I'm really excited about. So first off, why do we like text files so much? I'm sure this crowd has a fair amount of appreciation for text files, but just to go over some of the basics, they're very malleable. They're easy to hook up to code. You can just search them, find any content you want in them. You can find and replace and copy, place, stuff like that. And if you're editing text, you kind of have your choice of all these, existing IDEs that are polished and have lots of features in them, and they typically have extension marketplaces, so you can get even more advanced features or quality of life functionality. So in a lot of ways, by choosing to make most of our design content out of text files, we're leveraging this mature ecosystem of existing IDEs. So a lot of our day-to-day tooling ends up being just working in nice polished IDEs that we didn't have to build ourselves. So that's just kind of a part of our approach. And as you would imagine, having worked in text files for many projects, many years across different platforms and engines, we've built up a fair amount of code and processes around working with text files. And in fact, we have this library of code that has a name. We call it darkconfig. A few years ago, we open sourced it, so if you want, you can check it out at this GitHub URL. And what darkconfig does is it basically takes our YAML config files and converts them into usable gameplay data. It's also got cool features like hot loading and validation. We can validate the YAML syntax itself, and also it kind of serves as a platform for you to write your own validation for your game data. So you can kind of tell it what good or bad data looks like, and the validator will catch issues. And then we've also implemented these things, I kind of call them procedural patterns. They're these functionality in the configs that, again, lets us designers multiplier efforts. And I'm going to walk through a few examples of these procedural patterns we use in our configs, and that is going to lead into the design dashboard stuff. Okay, so pattern number one, this is a pretty familiar one probably. It's tags. So all our items and content have an optional list of tags that live in a central registry, and then any other piece of content or a system can refer to items by tags without having to refer to them by specific item IDs or content IDs. So you could have loot tables or crafting recipes or shop inventories that get populated with items by tag without having to create and maintain a list of specific items. And again, we like to make these kind of sprawling intertwined economies within our content systems. This is great for us because designers can just make new items and assign appropriate tags, and then that item just gets sucked into all these different systems automatically. It just starts showing up in loot tables and crafting recipes. So as long as you put in the right tags, it all works out great. Another pattern we use are includes. This one is also pretty simple, I think. Basically, you can, in a separate file from the config you're working in, you can make a little chunk of reusable config, a block of config, and give it a name, and then you can include it into another config. So you can use this for boilerplate and stuff. So like if you had all your decoration items, you want to have a shared piece of block of config, you can just write that once and then include it everywhere you need. You can also do these kind of composition style patterns where a config could be including like a handful of different blocks, and you can sort of compose different behavior by pulling in config blocks from different sources. And this is also an example here that I wanted to demonstrate. I kind of glossed over this with the dark config stuff, but there's this distinction between the YAML files, the configs that the designers are working in, which we call the source configs, and then the generated configs that actually get consumed by the game engine. And so dark config, there's this code that gets run at config generation time, which happens either at compilation when you run the game, or you can do it manually as a designer to sort of test your work. And it basically just, we call it reifies the actual working config. So up here on this screen, you can see on the left, those two might be examples of source configs that have the include pattern. And what that does in the generated config is it just copy and pastes the contents of the included config in place, and then ends with a kind of a final config. And that's an important point to understand for the next pattern going forward. Okay, so the next pattern is variance. This one's maybe a little more complicated. The way it works is we can flag a field or a part of a field in a config by wrapping it in chevrons, and that marks it as to be replaced by a variant. So in the example on the left, you've got a flower with the word type wrapped in chevrons, and that type part is meant to be replaced by variants. And down below, we have an array of variants that replace that type with one of 5 different flower types. And what happens at generation time is this one config actually turns into 5 new config files with each of their IDs having that type part replaced with a name of flower. So this is like a simple example just to demonstrate the basic philosophy, but and it's not actually doing anything interesting. It's just creating 5 different items with different IDs. They're not like distinctly different here, but because you can replace anything in the config basically with variants. You could use this to change the flower's color, the icon, the sprite, the economic behavior, all kinds of things using variants. And this is also simplified because it's one-dimensional in the sense that there's a single array that's getting subbed in for that variant portion. But the way we actually use these is in a multi-dimensional way. So this config, flower config, is a little closer to how like our actual flower configs, and you can see it has up in the top in the ID, it's got 3 fields. It's got type, season, and rarity. all marked for replacement by variants. And then down below, we've got 3 arrays of variants, one of types, one of seasons, and one of rarities. And what happens here is it does the same thing. It replaces them, but at config generation time, it actually generates an item for every possible combination of those 3 arrays. So you can see on the right sort of some examples where it'd be flower, aster, spring, common, flower, aster, spring, uncommon, etc., etc. So this one config makes 36 flowers because it's 3 times 4 times 3. That's also simplified. We usually have a lot more than that. And so this is how, in our game, Cozy Grove, if you've played it, we have these content buckets like our collectible flowers that spawn throughout the year, different seasons, and have different rarities and different species and different buy and sell prices and all that stuff. We have this bucket of content with hundreds of items for the player to collect over time that are all kind of created from a single config that the designer builds with variants and these procedural patterns, and it blows out into hundreds of configs at generation time. And so another pattern we use that kind of goes hand in hand with the variants is one called mods. This one basically allows you to, within a variant, modify numerical properties of the base config. So in this example, an uncommon rarity variant might apply mods to the drop weight, so like how likely the item is to show up in a random loot table, and the sell and buy prices, how valuable it is to buy and sell. And another kind of nice thing we do is we build these rarities, these rarity variants once, and then put them in this global file called global variants. So every config, like the flower config, doesn't have to have all the variants defined for rarity. They just reference a shared block of variants for rarity. Same with seasons, flower types, all kinds basically. And so you have this one config that again pulls in a bunch of variants. So whether it's mushrooms, flowers, fish, whatever we want to have rarity on it, for example, we just include that global variant, and now it has a common version, uncommon version all down the line, and it has its prices modified and stuff. Everything's kind of set up procedurally. So this is a system we've built up over the years. We really like it. It's got a lot of things going for it. It's very expressive. You can, when you get good at building these procedural configs, you can make all kinds of cool stuff happen. They're very expansible. Once you've set up something like the flower config, it's trivial to add essentially a new row to the matrix of like a new season or a new flower species. You just add a few lines of config and everything multiplies out, so you have all the associated variations. And with the tags and everything, we get all these nice emergent connections where we don't have to manually connect every little piece of content to another piece or to a system. It all just kind of happens through that substrate of the tags. But it does have downsides. It's kind of complicated to work in. I mean, if you looked at some of the actual configs, they're borderline code-like, and they can be unpredictable because when you're working in a source config that generates hundreds of generated configs, if you haven't really grokked how that source config is set up, you might accidentally make a bunch of bad content and not really fully realize it. And then obviously emergent connections are not always a good thing. It's easy to set up tags in the wrong way and get things connected that shouldn't be connected. So on our current project, like I said, we've been trying to address some of these downsides that have sort of accumulated over the years. And that's where this concept of our design dashboard comes in. The design dashboard is basically a tool we've built to help us get more insight into our own game data, especially our generated game data. So I've got so this is kind of just to review what we've said so far. We've got our source YAML files that the designers are actually authoring, which then at generation time blow out into many, many more generated configs. And then that chunk of generated configs are what actually get consumed by the game engine and determine what happens in the game. But it's also that generated configs that get consumed by the design dashboard. And so what is this design dashboard thing I'm talking about? It's basically a web page. It's an HTML page that consumes these text files and displays it in useful ways. So let's take a look at it. Hopefully you can see this okay. This is just a screenshot from the design dashboard. It's actually showing actual game data. And I'm going to give a little tour of what you're seeing here and kind of tell you what's going on. So we divide the design dashboard into these things called views, in the sense that they're different views into this kind of mass of game data. And this is our item view. This is our most fully featured view and the one we use most often. It's a table that shows items in the game with pertinent information that you want to see, with a bunch of different options for sorting and filtering and drilling down to basically see what items are getting generated by all these configs. So in the upper left there, you've got a little text field where you can enter in a partial item ID. Right now I'm searching for flower underscore, and so we're seeing 876 flower underscore item IDs out of the total 8,800 items that are in the configs currently. Then you've got these properties, this sidebar with a bunch of toggle boxes that you can turn on and off, and that shows and hides different columns of data. So depending on what you're trying to investigate in the data, you'll turn those on or off to only see what you need to see. There's a little column of blue Visual Studio Code icons. I don't know if you can see them, but it's right to the left of like all the column with all the item IDs. And those are, I love this feature, those are clickable buttons that when you click one, it pops open Visual Studio Code and opens the source config that generated that item, which is super useful. So you can use the design dashboard as kind of your first, when you're investigating some sort of issue, you start here, you find out the information you need, you click that button, and boom, you're into the config, and you could figure out what's going on from that point. Okay, so this is another view. This is our loot table view. And I'm looking at the piece on the left. I'll explain the piece on the right next. So this is basically, again, because our loot tables typically refer to items by tag. When you're authoring a loot table, you're not actually looking at the specific items that are going to drop from that loot table. You're describing the types of items you want to drop from that loot table by tags. But sometimes it's nice to know specifically what could drop out of a loot table. And so what we have in the loot table view is a little filter in the bottom left of the item view where there's a drop down with all our named loot tables in the game. You select one of those and it filters the list of items to only show items that will drop out of that loot table. And conversely, we also have this dropped by column, which is you can turn on and off in that sidebar of properties on the left. And what that does is for any given item, it lists out the loot tables that could drop that item. So this is really great if you're you have some random item in your inventory and we're like, where did that come from? You can look it up here and then look at the drop by column and then check out each one of those loot tables one by one to figure out how you got that item you weren't expecting to get. Okay, this is our content usage view. This one's a little more production focused, and it wasn't part of the original spec for the design dashboard, but we realized at some point it would be trivial to build this in the design dashboard, and it's been really useful. Basically, all it is a way to just search for occurrences of different types of named content in the game and count them. So in this one, we are looking at the dialogue, so all the written dialogue for NPCs in the game, and we're searching for instances of the different names of animations. So these are animations that the writer can annotate on a line of dialogue. So the NPC makes like an angry face when they're saying something angrily. And then on the column on the right is just how often those animations are being used in the entire, in all the game data. And this has been super useful for the writers to basically at a glance see how they are, what animations they are overutilizing or underutilizing. And likewise, the animators use this to see how writers are using their animations and using that to guide what animations they might want to make next. This one, we're starting to get into some of the work in progress ones because, again, this is a tool we're building and using on our current project. So this is our calendar view. What you're looking at here is actually a mock-up. The calendar view is actually in-game and working right now, but it's like not pretty enough for me to screenshot for this talk. So you just have to imagine it will look sort of like this. So our current game has a real-time calendar, just like our previous game, Cozy Grove. So we schedule things based on the day of the week or what season it is, or to correspond to holidays and things. And we do all that work again in a text file. We have a calendar YAML that has dates, and we can fill in the different scenarios and when they show up. But it's pretty hard just looking at that config file to sort of get a view of temporally what's going on, and that's what this calendar view is all about. It just draws those scenarios in a horizontal timeline view with their duration and some color coding, so that we can see, like, we could just at a glance, we can see what the coverage is on a given day. Is there enough stuff for a player to do on that day? Are there gaps where we've we've misscheduled something and there's a little gap and we need to move things to close those gaps? And so it just makes it way easier to do that scheduling work. This one is a future one that's on our roadmap for the near future. The screenshot you're looking at for right now is actually this is our economy view, I should say that. And the screenshot we're looking at right here is actually from a Google spreadsheet that a community member made for Cozy Grove 1 and shared out for everyone to use. And basically what they did is they manually entered all this data about all our decorations in the game, and they calculated based on the ingredient cost of the decorations and the sell price of the crafted decoration, the profitability of everything in the game. And that's what that color-coded column is on the side. So when they released this to the community and everyone started using it, our design team was first of all impressed, and we're like, oh wow, that's so cool how into the game they are. And then also mildly embarrassed because they had exposed some clear balancing issues where we had OP decorations where everyone was crafting this one uncommon chair because it was the best financially, is the best way to do it, and you just craft that chair over and over and sell it, make tons of money. And we had missed this stuff because we weren't manually setting the prices of these things. We were using all those procedural patterns. So the eventual prices and stuff kind of fell out of the mods and variants and all that stuff. And so, again, one of the downsides of using the patterns we use is it's easy to miss those patterns. And so in the moment when this happened, we kind of used the community's own spreadsheet to nerf the worst offenders. But our plan going forward is basically replicate something like this in the design dashboard, which should be very easy to do, so that we can see these kind of higher level patterns that are that come out of the data, the result out of the data that's hard to see when you're just editing a single config file. Another one, I hope we get to this one, but we're using a lot of procedural terrain generation for parts of our game, and I would love to have a view dedicated to basically statistical analysis of our generated terrain, so you could generate a bunch and then get data like stats on what pieces of content are being under or overutilized in the generated terrain, or how often a generated terrain meets the specs required by gameplay. So why do we like this stuff? Why do we like the design dashboard so much? It's easy to add these new views because it's HTML parsing, YAML, or technically JSON. We have local and remote versions of the dashboard, so the designers, when they're iterating, use a local version that just displays the data on their local machine, so they can edit the configs and refresh the dashboard and see the changes. And then we also have a remote version which represents the data on source control, the most recent data. And that one is really useful for non-designers to reference the game data or perform QA investigations, basically, by just going to this website. And again, because this is built off of Dart config, it's portable to our other Dart config projects. But philosophically, why do we like this so much? I mean, the main thing is we get to keep doing, building games the way we like to build them with a bunch of our text files with wacky procedural patterns that let us do all this wild, expressive stuff that sometimes gets us in trouble, but the design dashboard gives us a way to get a little less in trouble. Um, and ultimately, what it lets us do is get kind of this spreadsheet style visualization of what's going on, like the higher level patterns and connections in our game, without having to build and maintain a spreadsheet, which we have done many projects for many years. And for me, frankly, it's too much work. Doing it the old-fashioned way with spreadsheets. The spreadsheet you see right here is from Cozy Grove One. This is the progression roadmap of like all the unlocks and the econ for like the narrative econ and when the different quests come in and all this stuff. And it was hugely useful and allowed us to fix a lot of issues that came out of these kind of like emergent connections and stuff. But it was just a ton of work, and once you kind of take your eye off of it, it's sort of desynced from the game data, and it's just this ongoing upkeep cost. And so with the design dashboard, there's always a single source of truth. It's the game data. The configs are the truth, and the design dashboard gives us this kind of high level view, but it's derived from the game data. So we never have to. It's just it updates automatically, and we can customize it a lot. And so, yeah, if you have a heavy content game with a lot of intertwining economies or procedurally generated content, maybe consider building something like the design dashboard. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you for being understanding with us starting a little bit later. I do want to take the time for at least one question, given that we started late. This is one from Dash Clever, which is just asking, is there a team member who's focused on building this tooling, or is it something that the devs produce in between other game tasks?
We do have we don't have a lot of engineers who are like dedicated to a single thing at Spry Fox. We tend to reallocate people all the time, but we do have a engineer who this is their kind of pet project, and so he and I sort of like he'll come back onto it and add new views to it and iterate on it.
Cool. Which I guess may be related to that from Barbara D. How long has it taken to get the dashboard up and running? And what are the estimates on getting that economy part up and running?
It has been surprisingly quick. I think this is a thing that we've done. It's always a little hard to make a case for this kind of tooling where it's like it's really gonna hit its stride later in production, and it's competing with all this other feature work, building, standing up new systems and stuff. But it was not too hard to set up because again, it's HTML pages parsing JSON. Like those are both.
Yeah.
That's a match made in heaven, and then making subsequent views is also typically like a day or two to stand up a new view. So I suspect the econ one will be a few days, not a big deal.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, we were appreciating in the chat that there's been a kind of through line this weekend of a lot of these, make these domain specific tools, make them quickly, and even stuff like, using text, using these common kind of data types that are easy to parse, easy to do things with. Yeah. Excellent. Let's see, one last quick one from Hyper Gardens. How often do you change the data and content formats, and how hard is it to adapt?
The formats change. I mean, a lot of the stuff is kind of changes pretty slowly. Like those procedural patterns have been built up, and like they're kind of assumed every time we start up a new project, we're just going to use those again. But formats do change, especially when we're building a new system from scratch, and we're like, what are the configs for this system going to look like? Maybe it should be this would be a big array. No, that's not right. Let's change it. So I think it happens pretty frequently. And at least the dashboard so far has been pretty resilient to that, especially that item view, which like what an item is hasn't changed a whole lot, so that has been pretty stable.
Cool, excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for coming and for sharing. It's really wonderful for especially kind of like shipped games to be able to talk about their tools and things that have developed over time. That this is going to be a really useful resource for a lot of people, I think. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.